It's time to turn our attention, there you are, hi, attention to one of the biggest issues of the day, that of the prospect of expanding the Premiership to 13 teams. We talk about it quite a lot.
Yeah, we certainly do, and it's a conversation which hasn't really gone away, and it's come back up again. We've seen a brilliant competition which isn't quite over for this season, Ben. In a competition which is so buoyant and seems to be working so well, why are we having this conversation around adding another team?
I don't know. I don't agree with sort of a lack of relegation, which you'd have, I presume, for one season, wouldn't you, to get it up to 13. Having said that, there's a lot of financial interest coming into rugby from a lot of different angles, a lot of different competitions having it, and I guess, you know, the CVC money that's come into Premiership rugby, there's 13 teams that are party to that. So whether they want to sort of not ring fence it, but almost go halfway between the two, because there's talk of there being a playoff system or relegation or whatever coming up and down. So I think it's down to that. Whether it's needed, I don't know. I think one of the big issues, there's going to be a massive change in rugby over the next few years, with all these people sort of vying for position. But one thing that's undoubtedly true is player welfare is becoming a much more important part of the game. And as a result, I am convinced teams are going to need bigger squads. You know, we're talking about expanded competitions. The players are going to be asked to play less rugby, in my opinion. It's going to get reduced down. As a result, squads are going to need to be bigger to manage that, but also manage the concussion awareness that we're now seeing, and teams really struggling during the season. There were many teams that couldn't field a player that was used to playing in position this year because they just didn't have the numbers. So perhaps there's an element of, you know, though, if they're looking at 13 teams, well, let's make sure that we can keep them buoyant and those teams that are in the 13 and fill the squads with enough players to cope with the competition.
Just a point on that, actually, I think it's a really good point, Grace. Ben talking about needing these bigger squads. So would we be looking at perhaps further investment into the academies to make sure that they're filled with quality potential, especially if there isn't going to be that relegation, to give them game time? Are we looking at further investment and larger squads in the first team?
Well, I think it's incredibly difficult to try and wind back salaries.
Yeah.
Suddenly turn around to guys and say, oh, by the way, after this next contract, you're going to drop down by 20% because we're going to invest in a wider academy squad. That's just not the reality of the situation. I think the safety of ostensibly a ring-fenced league, even though there's talk of a playoff for the bottom team against the top from the championship, essentially you're talking about a ring-fenced league.
Yeah.
The risk of playing a young player and losing might be something to do with European qualification, but it's not going to bust your business. So you would assume that squads would be more happy to use their young players and give them opportunity. And to be perfectly honest with you, Northampton, as an example, this season, a lot of their recovery has been based on young lads playing week in, week out and growing within the tournament. And they finished fourth. So I don't know where the fear comes from.
The danger for expanded squads is you get a few players that never get to play. Yeah. And that's a big issue, because players will only get better if they're playing the games. No amount of training that can teach you that. So the other option is you try and get some relationship with the championship clubs and the Premiership clubs, so that it's almost a two-way street, and you're sending players out to play and develop. The likes of Dan Cole, Billy Twelvetrees, all developed, having been Leicester Academy players, playing senior men's rugby in the Championship. So bringing that together, and maybe you change whether you're allowed to come up or go down if you use Premiership players. I don't know, it was something that was mooted by Nigel Melville before, but maybe that's an option that could be looked at as well.
Oz, should Premiership fans be getting excited by this possibility or not?
I think we had the best league, arguably, until we see what happens in the knockout stages this year. So it's really good. I think that if you look long-term, bigger picture, I think we're going to see a fundamental change in how long the game is played for. I think maybe we won't play for 80 minutes. I think,
really?
I think maybe it'll be reduced, because we're talking about player welfare. And what CVC and TVs want is they want to see these high-intensity games week in, week out. And the players can't sustain that, because you want to see Owen Farrell playing every single big game as opposed to just playing 50% of them.
There'll be a couple more bye weeks, won't there?
Yeah, so exactly. But I don't think bye leagues work. I think it doesn't work. But I do think that we might see 20 minutes for half time and the game only lasting for maybe 70 minutes.
Well, that's going to be a huge
But, I'm
change.
just a pioneer of these sorts of things. So, I don't want to take all the credit for it. But you heard it here first.
Yeah.